Oh, hello, and welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I'm your host, Dr. Mack, and today we will continue our two-part format of Women in the Bible, and we're in the Old Testament as well as Blacks in the Bible, and we will do a companion piece to that. So today, we're going to start with a quote from Victor L. Ludlow, who said, "Three sources of instruction were recognized by the Israelites. One, the prophets speaking for God. Two, the priests teaching God's word. And three, the wise men understanding God's works." And that's from Unlocking the Old Testament. And it's appropriate today because we're going to focus in on three, the wise men, understanding God's words. So we're going to be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, which contains the reflections of a philosopher, often referred to as the teacher or the preacher. Although the writer of Ecclesiastes was a believer in the God of Israel, he writes to address religious issues for which he is seeking answers. The book reflects the views of an Israelite whose theoretical training and life experiences induced him to question many of the accepted beliefs of the Hebrew tradition. So, our topic: Women in the Bible, no upright woman. And part two, Blacks in the Bible, a review of an article, well, two articles regarding suffering and the meaning of life in Egyptian literature. The Bible source for today is the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verses 25 through 29. Although we will go back and take a look at some verses from First King as well as Proverbs and Job. The name of the third section of the Hebrew Bible is simply the writings, which hardly does justice to the variety of religious expressions found there. There is poetry of the temple, ritual, private prayers, wisdom, national tragedy, and even love. There is philosophical explorations of the wisest path in life, of God's goodness and justice. There are historical retellings and short stories. The writings might be better translated as the anthology, the collection from the post prophetic age. Most of the individual books in the writings were written or at least put in final form in Judea during the period of the Persian and Hellenistic rule from the 5th through the 2nd century BCE. The temple in Jerusalem, destroyed in the Babylonian conquest in 586, had been rebuilt around 515. The text of the Torah was standardized not long after, but there was no more prophecy after Malachi. Clues of language, literary style, and content have led scholars to see most of the writings as Second Temple works. Unlike the Torah and the books of the prophets, the writings do not present themselves as the fruits of direct divine inspiration. Daniel is the one exception. What makes books like Psalms and Job so remarkable is their humanity and the I who dare to voice uh, questions and doubts about God in the face of danger or suffering. Ultimately, each of the writings affirms a hard won commitment to God and the covenant. Without divine miracles or national glory, there were only the words of the Torah and prophets to hold on to, proven reliable things in Israel's difficult history, and to carry the people towards wisdom. Now, the book of Ecclesiastic is structured and divided into three parts. Part one, we have the introduction of the teacher. Part two, we have details um, of the words of the teacher. And then part three presents the author's reflection on the words of the teacher. The book of Ecclesiastes is a fascinating and a complex piece of literature. It is often referred to as one of the most challenging books in the Bible. Ecclesiastes is a reflection on the meaning of life, the pursuit of happiness, and the inevitability of death. Its author, who identifies himself as the teacher or the preacher, presents a unique perspective on these topics, which has captured the imagination of readers for centuries. The themes of the book are universal and timeless, and they deal with human experiences of joy, suffering, and everything in between. The book is attributed to King Solomon, who is considered and was considered to be one of the wisest men in the Old Testament. It is structured, as stated before, into three sections. However, it is structured in such a way that the series of observations and reflections often presented in the form of poetry, and it's designed to cause us to self-reflect and to urge us to ask ourselves some hard questions about life. One of the key teachings in Ecclesiastic is the idea that everything in life is ultimately meaningless, which is one hard one to accept. The author uses the Hebrew term hebel to convey this sense of futility and pointlessness. This does not mean that life is without value, but rather that the pursuit of material wealth or worldly success is ultimately unsatisfactory. Another important teaching in Ecclesiastic is the idea that life is fleeting and transient. The author uses metaphors such as, and I really like this one, as chasing after the wind to convey this sense of impermanence. This does not mean that life is without purpose, but rather that we should live our lives with a sense of urgency and purpose. Finally, Ecclesiastics emphasizes the importance of finding joy and contentment in the present moment. The author the author encourages us to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, such as good food, companionship, and the beauty of the natural world. The message is not that we should give up on our goals and aspirations, but rather that we should not lose sight of the joys that are available to us in the present moment. Now, the interpretation and interpreting of Ecclesiastic, is as varied as there are scholars who read the work. As I said earlier, it is both complex and thought provoking, and it has been interpreted down through the centuries to mean different things to different people. We will share some of those today as we take a look at the meaning and the purpose of it. So let's take a look at the literal and is it a literal work or is it an allegorical work? One of the primary debates regarding Ecclesiastic concerns the question of whether the text should be read literally or allegorically. Some argue that the book should be taken at face value and viewed as a straightforward commentary on the nature of existence. Others suggest that the author employs allegory and symbolism to convey deeper meanings and insights. Those who advocate for a literal interpretation of Ecclesiastics argue that the author's message is clear and straightforward. They believe that the book is a reflection on the futility of human endeavors and the ultimate emptiness of material pursuits. According to this perspective, the author's observations about the vanity of life should be taken at face value without seeking any hidden meanings or metaphors. On the other hand, proponents of the allegorical interpretation of Ecclesiastics suggest that the book is filled with symbols and metaphors, and that the author's observations about the vanity of human pursuits are meant to be understood in a deeper, more spiritual sense. According to this view, the author's pessimistic reflections on the meaninglessness of life or an invitation to search for deeper truths and spiritual fulfillment. Another issue surrounding the interpretation of Ecclesiastic concerns the author's intention. Many scholars believe that the book was written by an anonymous sage or philosopher, while others suggest that it was authored by King Solomon himself. Those who advocate for the anonymous authorship of Ecclesiastic suggest that the book is a reflection of common wisdom and themes that were prevalent in ancient Israel. According to this view, the author is not attempting to convey a specific message or agenda, but rather is offering a universal perspective on the human condition. Those who believe that King Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes argue that the book is a reflection of the monarch's own spiritual journey. According to this view, the book is a deeply personal reflection of Solomon's struggles with the emptiness of worldly pursuits and his ultimate realization that true fulfillment can only be found in a life dedicated to God. Another important aspect of interpreting Ecclesiastic concerned the theological significance. Some scholars view the book as a direct challenge to traditional Jewish and Christian teaching, while others suggest that it is a valuable supplement to existing religious doctrine. Those who see ecclesiastics as a challenge to traditional religious teachings argue that the book's emphasis on the vanity and the meaninglessness of life is at odds with the optimistic, faith filled perspective of Judaism and Christianity. According to this view, Ecclesiastics represents a rebellious, skeptical voice that challenges the certainties and dogmas of an organized religion. Others suggest that Ecclesiastics represents an important complement to traditional religious teaching. According to this view, the book emphasizes the transcendence of worldly pursuits that serve as a reminder of the eternal nature of God and the importance of faith in a life well lived. In this sense, Ecclesiastics is seen as a valuable counterbalance to the more opportunistic and faith filled perspective of traditional religious teaching. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Ecclesiastes, first chapter, second verse. Regardless of one's interpretation of Ecclesiastics, it is clear that the book represents a profound and multifaceted reflection on the nature of human existence. Its insights and wisdoms remain highly relevant and thought provoking today and continue to challenge readers to explore the deeper meanings and purposes of life. The book of Ecclesiastic is full of profound reflections on the nature of life and the pursuit of happiness. The author, often referred to as the preacher or the teacher, examines the fertility of certain pursuits and the inevitability of death, urging readers to find meaning and purpose in the present moment. One of the central themes of Ecclesiastic is the concept of wisdom. The preacher or the teacher extols the virtues of wisdom, describing it as a shield that protects us in the face of life's challenges. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. The preacher also contrasts wisdom with foolishness, cautioning readers against the dangers of arrogance and self importance. The fool walks in darkness, and all his days are spent in foolishness. The reflections on wisdom and foolishness, with those, the author emphasizes the importance of humility and self awareness in our quest for meaning and purpose. Another philosophical theme explored in Ecclesiastics is the concept of time. The preacher or the teacher notes that everything in life is subject to the passage of time. from the changing of the seasons to the aging of the human body. For everything, there is a season and a time for every matter under the heaven. The inevitability of time's passage is also reflected in the preacher's reflections on death. Rather than fear or avoid death, the author encourages readers to embrace the transcendence of life and make the most of each moment. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. The philosopher's musings within the book of Ecclesiastes challenges the reader to examine their own lives and consider what truly matters. By embracing humility and wisdom and by recognizing the fleeting nature of time, we can find a deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment in our lives as we go through. Those interpretations of Ecclesiastics is an overview as we talk about the author. The accepted author of Ecclesiastes, oh, 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt in the ninth century before the Common Era, the Jewish Commonwealth reached its zenith economically and purely, including the land it controlled directly and the alliances it had. Militarily and intellectually, it was the center of civilization. The entire world beat a path to Jerusalem, and it happened under the reign of Solomon, called Son of David. The problem with reaching the zenith is that the only way to go is down. At the beginning of Solomon's life, the dreams and promises of the Bible had been fulfilled, including the building of the temple. As it happened under the reign of Solomon, the Jewish people would not be able to handle success as it was fulfilled. They became fat and they started to kick, as in Deuteronomy 32nd chapter 15 verse. Success is a heady wine. Even an individual as great as Solomon and a people as great as the Jewish people were unable to sustain their success. They became very complex and contradictory. Solomon was immensely complex and layered in his personality. For that reason, both the biblical record as well as the oral tradition exhibit ambivalence towards him, unlike that towards anyone else. Solomon is both heroic and anti heroic. He represents grandeur, nobility, wisdom, and piety. At the same time, he represents base desires, pettiness, and self destructive tendencies. Solomon was 12 when he succeeded to the throne. He reigned 40 years and died at the age of 52. The first 4 years were the best years of his reign. That was when he asked for the gift of wisdom that God bestowed upon him. First Kings, third chapter, verses 5 and 9. My son, if your heart is wise, my heart too shall rejoice. Proverbs 23, verse 15. I also rejoice in your wisdom, God said of Solomon. His wisdom was not merely intellectual. His intuitiveness in understanding things, and he could smell when there was a charlatan involved, as in the famous case of the two women claiming to be the mother of the same child. That's in First Kings, third chapter, 6 verses 16 through 28. Tradition teaches that the wise men of Athens and Greece were indirect disciples of Solomon. He taught them mathematics, engineering, philosophy, and other abstract things. Theoretical, esoteric subjects that the Greeks later became famous for had his birth in Solomon. Solomon had a profound influence upon everyone that came to meet him. Monarchs arrived from all over the world to seek his advice and test his wisdom. The Queen of Sheba was one of them. She traveled from far away Ethiopia to ask him to solve three riddles, which he promptly did, as First Kings 10th chapter verses 1 to 3. Even as a teen, Solomon was recognized as the world's premier man of ideas and thoughts. The problem with such greatness is that it causes one to believe in oneself. The beginning of his demise came after 4 years as king when he married the daughter of the Pharaoh. This is First Kings 3rd chapter, 1st verse. It was a politically expedient move, as many of the marriages in the ancient world were, but it was spiritually a disaster, despite the fact that she converted and was herself a great person. Tradition many times described how things were before the daughter of Pharaoh and after the daughter of Pharaoh. Before the marriage, Solomon's wisdom was all good. Afterwards, it undid him. Do not be too wise, he wrote in reference to himself. Ecclesiastes 7 chapter 16 verse. One of the effects of having too much knowledge was that he saw himself above the law. The Torah says that a king should not accumulate too much money for himself. That's in Deuteronomy 17, chapter 17, verse. Solomon accumulated it anyway. Ecclesiastes 2nd chapter 8, verse. The Bible said that a king should not have too many wives. Deuteronomy 17, chapter 17, verse. Solomon had 1,000 wives. The Bible also said that the king should not have too many horses. Deuteronomy 17, chapter 16, verse, which was another way of saying not to have too big of an army. Military expenditures tend to take on a life of their own and become self perpetuating. The same verse concludes, and do not lead to people back to Egypt. Deuteronomy 17, chapter 17, verse. Even after its decline, Egypt retained its natural wealth and thus served as the symbol of overindulgence in materialism. God wanted to keep the Jews far from the allures of Egypt. Among its allures, Egypt was the horse breeding capital of the ancient world. Any investment in military would lead the nation back to Egypt in a sense of either trade and compromise, if not physically as well. No, not me, Solomon said. I can deal with Egypt. He could not deal with Egypt. He ended up having to marry the daughter of the king of Egypt and accepting all the compromises and alliances that went along with it. Because Solomon acted as if he was greater than the law eventually caught up with him. After all is weighed in the balance, although Solomon had faults, he is counted among the greatest of the Jewish people. At least part of that can be attributed to the three remarkable books he left to posterity: Song of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. The temple he built was destroyed. The empire he built was destroyed. His palace was destroyed. The wealth he accumulated was plundered, but his books live forever. Song of Songs is one of the most magnificent pieces of human poetry ever put to paper. Although on the surface it is a love duet between a man and a woman, in the deeper sense, it is an allegory of the love between God and the Jewish people. The only way that relationship can even reach a metaphorical state is to represent it in the love between a man and a woman. The great sage of the Israelites, as well as many other sages, agreed that if all of the Torah is holy, then the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. It is the ultimate expression of longing for the divine. The gift of the Song of Songs alone assured Solomon immortality. The second book he wrote was Proverbs. It is a combination of philosophy, wisdom, social science, and good common sense. Solomon's third book was Ecclesiastes, the one we're discovering today. It is his most problematic book. It is difficult that the comment reported that there were sages who wanted to exclude it from the biblical canon. On the surface, the book has many contradictions. If one takes verses out of context, it sounds like he says things that are theoretical. The book has to be taken as a whole, or it is easily misunderstood, as we shall see today. It can be said that Ecclesiastes is the first book of Jewish philosophy. It takes all the other philosophies present at that time, hedonism, fatalism, and even Epicureanism that came later, and draws them out to their ultimate illogical conclusion. Even the best philosophy is good only up to a certain point. Philosophy is like a blanket that is too small. A person tries to cover himself and moves it to one part of his body, but then he exposes a different part. He moves to cover that part, but exposes something else. No matter what he does, the blanket is always too small to cover everything. Something is always sticking out. That is philosophy, even the best ones. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon plays the devil's advocate, so to speak, for every philosophical theory. He describes it and sometimes may even seem to indulge in it. Nevertheless, then he points out its weaknesses, its fatal flaws, and concludes that it is vain and empty. The last line reads, "The end of the matter, after all has been heard, fear the Lord and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, which you will hear repeated today. After we've considered everything, Solomon concludes we are left with faith. We are left with faith. There are no philosophy answers everything. A person has to have faith. We are not privy to all of God's ways or answers. And what was the aftermath? He lost control and his wives took over. According to Jewish tradition, he was driven from the throne and replaced by a pretender for the years while he wandered in exile. His end was not heroic. In that regard, his life story served as the forerunner of the impending doom awaiting the Jewish commonwealth. It was a foreshadowing that was to come. The Jewish people never again attained the stature, either spiritually or materially, that they attained at the beginning of Solomon's reign. Instead of becoming strong and united, the Jewish kingdom became weak and divided until its ultimate destruction. Now, in addition to having given that part of Ecclesiastes, let's take a look at someone who wrote more, and that would be Dr. Claude Marinetti. When he wrote about the book of Ecclesiastes, he talked about the debate over the authorship of the book. The title of the book is associated with Solomon, he wrote, the words of the teacher. He acknowledged him as the son of David, and he's quoting Ecclesiastes' first chapter, first verse. This association of the book with Solomon comes because Solomon's role in establishing the wisdom school in Israel. Now, the Talmud declared that Hezekiah and his company wrote Ecclesiastes. Hezekiah, the king of Judah, in the 7th century BC, 715 to 687, tried to revive the glory of the literary activity and wisdom movement that was the hallmark of Solomon's kingdom. Zedekiah and his men probably were also responsible for the final compilation of the book of Proverbs. These are other proverbs of Solomon that officials of the king Hezekiah of Judea copied. And that's Proverbs 25 in the very first verse. It is possible the Koheleth himself wrote the book using the impersonation of Solomon as a literary device. Koheleth is if we have to have a protagonist in the story, well, yes, we'll call it a narrative. In the narrative, it would be Koheleth. Several statements in the book could have been spoken by Solomon. For example, and I love this one, Koheleth criticized the king for not accepting advice. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who will no longer take advice. Ecclesiastes 4th chapter 13th verse. Now, uh, we are comfortable with the fact that he wrote three of these books. According to the rabbinic sources, when Solomon wrote the Song of Songs with its accent on love, it was in his youth. When he wrote Proverbs with its emphasis on practical problems in his maturity, he was in his middle age, his maturity. And when he wrote Ecclesiastes with its melancholy reflections on vanity of life, he was in his old age. Now, the date that it was written is around 935 BC. Not total consensus on the date, but there is at least enough. Now we know that can be verified by the language that is used and some of the incidents there. Ecclesiastes was written for the ancient Israelites and for our later Bible readers. Scholars differ on the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes. The author of the book was a man rooted in his Israelite faith, but who struggled for a believable answer to the questions which had arisen out of his experiences in life. I must emphasize out of his experiences in life. No upright woman comes from those experiences. The book presents a skeptical judgment on religion and on the superficial and opportunistic portrayals of the meaning of human life. His conclusion is that the duty of human beings is to fear God and to keep his commandments, even though it may or may not be meaningful to do so, at least in the eye of another human being. The author believed in God, but he does not believe that one can adequately discern the ways by which God governs the universe. Now, life according to Ecclesiastes, he refers to it the nature of life, and he's reflecting on the fleeting nature of our existence and the pursuit of worldly pleasures. The author is believed to be King Solomon, who speaks honestly and openly about his own experiences and observations, providing a unique perspective on the human condition. Throughout the book, the author emphasizes the vanity of material possessions and worldly achievements, urging readers to instead seek meaning and purpose in life. The themes of wisdom and the nature of life is also prevalent throughout Ecclesiastes, providing a philosophical basis for understanding our place in the world. Each verse almost in Ecclesiastes requires a little more. The themes, lack of meaning and purpose in life apart from God, the limitations of wisdom, enjoying God's good gifts, the fear of God. Those are themes that he had. He wanted mankind to embrace a balanced perspective in life, and he said that was something that we were not doing. We were not embracing that balanced perspective. He recognizes that life is full of both good and bad experiences and that one must learn to accept and navigate both. The author encouraged the readers to enjoy the good times in life. He embraced both the joys and the struggles of life, and that we had to learn to live in harmony with nature. The setting of the book is actually, or the landscape of the book is, as actually we've said earlier, um, is post-exilic, and we have them being in Jerusalem, where they were, especially Solomon, was familiar with the texts of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, as well as the Greeks. Therefore, we have the meaning of life and suffering that was widespread throughout the Mediterranean world in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the characters that we have in the book, we basically have um, Kohelet, you know, and we have God. So we have a landscape from which the book of Ecclesiastes is written. Um, we have three words we need to take a look at, which is coherence and significance, as well as purpose, which he has done. But the big word that we have to deal with today is, what does it mean to be upright? And we cannot take the meaning of upright as we know it today. We have to go back and we have to take the biblical meaning of what were the character traits of one who was upright. Because here we have Solomon said that there were no upright women. He was unable to find an upright woman. So here we have, if we're going to take a look, Greg Gang gives us a real good example of that. Upright, basically, uh, you can find it in biblical verses, in historical contexts, and in scholarly interpretations. So, upright in the Bible, it encompasses moral integrity, righteousness, and adherence to God's commandment. Okay? The word upright encompasses moral integrity, righteousness, and adherence to God's commandments. And there's more to be said, and there are verses from both Proverbs and Job. It's really in Job where you notice the first time we're talking about uprightness. So what Solomon was looking for was an upright person. And in biblical times, it was of great significance, and it defined one's character as an individual if he or she were righteous in the eyes of God. It encompasses not only the moral behavior, but also the strong commitment to justice, compassion, and the pursuits of God's will. That is what an upright person was. So that concept was a guiding principle for the ancient societies in discerning right from wrong and maintaining moral order, something that we have to have. And even today, it is relevant for one to be upright. Now, chapter 7 encompasses so very much. So we won't go through verse by verse because we're focusing only on 25 through 29. But we have the value of wisdom. Solomon compares the value of a good name to a precious ornament. He does so very much. He advises that sorrow can be better than laughter, as it refines the heart. It's just rich with so much. But in his quest for a better life, we do meet Kohelet, and he too is the fictional person searching for a better life for every individual. And we have that within the book of Ecclesiastes. And he actually, you see within him so much of Solomon. And that becomes part of the primary lesson in Ecclesiastes, is that money and power cannot satisfy that unnameable, I love that word, unnameable hunger of the human spirit. The human spirit is hungry for meaning and for assurance that life matters, that the world will be a different place once answers are found to that particular question. So, Khalid, theme is that human life without God is vanity and empty of meaning. Um, he illustrates this theme by stating the futility of all wisdom, the vanity of pleasure and labor. To him, everything in life is hollow. It is like vapor, and it amounts to very little. So this is what we have when you just get it all the way down to, especially the literal interpretation of the book of Ecclesiastes. So the message of the book of Ecclesiastes is a message that can also be addressed to people who live in the 21st century, people who are trapped in a world of materialism, secular humanism, greed, and hedonism. So the people in the book of Ecclesiastes, though years and years ago, are subject to the same kinds of things. Khalif discovers that people try to live their complex lives independent of God without living their lives according to the purposes for which the Creator intended. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Ecclesiastes 12th chapter, first verse. Now we the fact that he could not find, as he reflected on his life, he could not find an upright woman. It leads us to the logical conclusion that based on the experiences and the women with whom he had been around, they were not there. Excuse me. Solomon had a harem of 1,000 wives. 700 wives, 300 concubines. But he refers to them as, and we go back through to Proverbs, really Proverbs 1 and 9, where his mom is giving him the instructions that we talked about in an earlier session about women. And he refers to that, the snares and the traps and the fact that the women that he met, each of them wanted something. He had met one man out of 1,000, but not one woman. Now, there are scholars who say the 1,000 is the inclusion of the wives and the concubines, and that could have been a hectic life, living as king and harem, and the person over the harem, with each and every woman wanting something. So the word woman appears three times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's in the 7th chapter, verse 26, 7th chapter, verse 28, and the 9th chapter, verse 9. So when he speaks of the woman who is a trap, he talks about the woman being a trap. He, meaning Khalif, he does that. He talks about her being a trap. That's in verse 26. And in verse 9 and 9, Khalif speaks positively. Notice what happens here. This is earlier, before 26, about women when he talks about the joy of marital love and the pleasures and the satisfaction of life when one lives with the woman whom he loves. Enjoy happiness with the woman that you love. Okay? So that becomes that. And then we get, as we go on down, we get the other verses where he talks about I find a woman more bitter than death. That's in Ecclesiastic 26. And again, you can see here that he's at the end of his life. He has lived a life. She is all traps. Her hands are feathers, and her heart is snares. You cannot hide the fact that this translation, as it stands, gives you the picture of a misogynistic man. But this is a man who is bitter. He talks about a woman being more bitter than death, and death being the ultimate end thereof. So we have these three instances where he talks about women. Actually, Solomon talks about women through his character, Khalid. And we don't see a lot of editing, at least the sages and the scholars don't believe there's a lot of editing there. But the fact that he cannot find a an upright woman, and later he talks about there was maybe one, but the one man. but I like the way he handles it. Now, when we talk about Solomon's wife, um, when we talk about Solomon's wife, that there's an allusion to that possibility in this particular chapter. We also talk about Khalid's wife. Um, and here, his idea was to take a wife and that all would be well. But I love the way some of the critics are writing. They are saying that Solomon had, if he had stopped at one wife, we have the supposition that if he had stopped at one wife, he may have been happy. And there are those scholars who say that this whole "no upright woman" was a popular saying at the time that Solomon had Khalid um, say because it was popular. There are an equal number of scholars who agree with that, but then all come to the conclusion that um, the moral compass of the character here really wanted to please God. He wanted to be good before the face of God, but he was a sinner. And God created humanity with dignity, identity, and vocation, but humanity created their own paths. And we are talking back, for those of you who need to think quickly back, we're talking about Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly, Folly. So we have here, we have the story of, we have this story of looking for this woman right in the middle of the quest for life, this journey for life. I'm going to switch very quickly to um, the blacks in the Bible and the suffering of Egypt. One of the reasons that I can do that is because we said earlier that Solomon knew all of these things about suffering that was going on in the ancient world at the time, and that I chose Egypt because he married the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, there is no doubt that his downfall was caused by having all of these women here. And remember, Bathsheba did remind him that they would come, if he was into sex, then they would come to him and manipulate him through sex. And that's happened between the political marriages and his obsession with women. All of the scholars agree that he pretty much was obsessed with women. But particularly in Egypt, there are parallel stories to this story that we have regarding the suffering that was going on, the suffering on the quest to understand the meaning of life. Here we have God. Solomon is writing about the Israeli God. And in Egypt, they are writing about a goddess named Moet, who incorporated justice and morality and all of that in one. But here is an idol god. Can you imagine what happened when he put up the altar to this particular god and knowing that he sinned? I love the fact that he acknowledges that he did sin. And because he put it down on a scroll, he had a communal audience. He's not just saying to a few, a few of his counselors, he's saying to everyone that I sinned when I did this. I understand this was my downfall. And more respect for Solomon as we go through and come up with that. The rhetoric there is great. And we have all of the commentators, biblical commentators that we normally would use, who had these things to say about Solomon and the fact that the women that he had been warned against were there, and the fact that perhaps he couldn't find the upright woman because he couldn't find them because of where he was looking. And then when you put all the books together, you understand. And that was why we mentioned the books, the Song of Songs, the Book of Proverbs, and now Ecclesiastes. You can see the growth. The growth is not necessarily good growth, but you can see the growth that he undergoes. The place and the time were important in Ecclesiastic. We talked about time being important, but the life lessons that Solomon learns are basically those that we have to endure every day. Um, the pessimism in the literature that he had, especially regarding the morality and the justice, as well as the truth, the personification of truth. So, um, the goddess Moet, as well as the god that the Israelites worship. Um, the pessimism is there in the ancient writings as well as the current writings. There's one thing I'd like to call your attention to. Um, there, Bernard Shaw wrote a piece in the earth years ago, and we always say, okay, we can't get anything, yes, from old, but you can. It's the story of a black girl in search of her God. If you get a chance, go back and take a look at that. It's not very long, and it may have things that make you go, ah, but go back and take a look at that. As well as if we're going to bring over the Egyptian um, literature, we can take a look at The Good Fortunes of the Dead, which is an Egyptian piece. We have The Song of Harper, which is one of the better pieces. It's about innocent suffering, and the question is addressed in the Bible, like the book of Job. Uh, the Egyptians also had a pessimistic piece of literature about the Song of Harper, which has to do with the suffering of an innocent and the realization of what we have there. But what is the legacy of all of this? Well, we have to understand if we did not have Ecclesiastes, there would be those of us who would be out trying to hook, and there are those who have made quote unquote gods out of what they have, the materialistic things they have, the secular things they can do, the social standings that they have. But Ecclesiastic shows us a man who lived through this process, this journey. It's not a physical journey per se, it is a journey of reflection. And he came out on the other side a much wiser and a much more seasoned man. Um, we find that the temptations of life are empty, and that if we just remember what he says in Ecclesiastic 12 and 13, keep the commandments and basically to keep the faith, we'll find out that life is destined to remain unsatisfying apart from our own recognition of God's intervention. It only remains to be seen whether or not we will place our trust in God's sure and capable hands. Um, we struggle sometimes to misplace the pursuits of our lives. We ask ourselves the questions of what do we desire, and but we have to remember and hear the words of Solomon that they might encourage each of us to place our trust solely in the Lord. Keep the last verse in mind as you go through, and all will be well with you. Remember the lessons regarding the application thereof. Okay? It represents the journey from one point to another. Yeah. I don't believe he was a misogynistic person. I think if you take a look at the reading, and I'm not being an anti-feminist or womanist writer, I am simply saying that I don't believe that's what it was designed to be. You have to look at it, and we have, remember, many of the other sessions, we would have to look at it in terms of how it was perceived, the time it was written, and what was the purpose of the author. And we have to take a look at what is happiness, you know, what brings us to this point of elimination of things that will give us the true happiness and let us live in the moment and encourage and enjoy the spouse that we have. Um, I won't refer to them as Solomon and his harem, and many times he's referred to by even the scholars as what? A pig or one who was surrounded by floozies. But these women, according to the time, they were in a harem and each one was trying to get in front of the other. Join me next week as we take a look at the Song of Solomon. We will still be with Solomon, but we will be looking at the piece that he wrote early in his life when he understood more. He was not in the business of philosophizing as well. And we'll take a look at the use of the color black. And the reason we looked at Egypt today, because Egypt was one of the African states. The suffering was parallel. Just as the Israelis understood suffering, the Egyptians did too. The difference is God for the Israelis and Moab for the Egyptians. I hope that you've enjoyed our session today. If you have questions and or comments, please feel free to take a look at our website as it goes along the crawl at the bottom of your screen and share your comments and or your questions. May God bless and keep you. Thank you for joining us.